Thank you, Jamie. We are looking forward to that new series that's going to be starting off next week. But as Jamie mentioned this morning, we're finishing up. We're not quite there yet. We're finishing up a brief teaching series that we have been doing where we're looking at how the revolutionary teaching of Jesus about money and about how we use our money and relate to money, how that can really help us be rich well in the world today. You know, we hear lots and lots of messages in our world about things that we can do to get rich and to get rich quickly. You know, there's Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes, all those kinds of things out there. But the truth is, many of us already are rich. We don't often think about ourselves that way, but just factually speaking, it's true. If you make $40,000 a year or more as a family, you're in the top 5% of wage earners in the entire world. And if you have access to things like education and clean water, and you don't even worry about those kinds of things, then you just really have access to wealth and resources that many other people around the world can't even imagine. I mean, just looking at the numbers, we are rich. So congratulations to us. But the good news is, we're rich, but the bad news is that oftentimes we're not necessarily doing a good job at being rich, at least not in the way that Jesus would like us to be rich. And again, just because we're rich also doesn't mean that we're good at dealing with some of the dangers that come along with that. For example, one of the things that we've seen in this series is that more you have, the greater temptation there is to undergo what one author called a migration of hope. Right? You go from putting your trust and your hope in God as the one who provides for us and protects us and cares for us. Inevitably, the more you have, that hope just sort of tends to migrate away from God, and you begin to put your hope in the stuff that you have, thinking that ultimately that's what can protect you, that's what can provide for you. Even though we all know that that's not a good thing to do. We know that the stuff we have doesn't last. We know that earthly wealth is fleeting. And we know that because we look at the news and we see what happens in the stock market. You track the stock market over a month and you recognize just how fleeting some of that wealth is as you watch sort of accounts go and balances go and people get depressed about that. So for what we've done for the past few weeks to try to get a different perspective is we've been spending our time just looking at 3 short verses in the letter of 1 Timothy. And what I'd like to do is invite you guys to turn there with me, if you would, to 1 Timothy chapter 6. If it would help you for any reason, there are some red Bibles in the seats in front of you. You can grab one of those and turn to the page number that's there on the screen so that we can read together. But again, the passage we're going to be looking at is part of a letter that was written by an early Christian leader named Paul to a young pastor, a young leader named Timothy. And Timothy was leading a church in Ephesus, which is what we know now. It was in modern-day Turkey. And he had sort of a unique leadership challenge there because there were some people in that church in Ephesus who were rich. They had more money than what they needed to sort of take care of their own needs. But they weren't necessarily good at being rich because nobody had really ever given them any instruction on what does it look like to be rich in a way that honors the work and the teaching and the example and the model of Jesus Christ. So near the end of chapter 6, Paul delivers this really short but really powerful set of teaching on what it means to be rich well. And Paul knows that money can often cause anxiety and tension in our lives, right? We experience that a lot of times too in the way we interact with money. But he knows it doesn't have to be that way. Because based on the teachings of Jesus, he understands that if we can change the way we think about money and change the way that we relate to money, money doesn't have to stress us out. In fact, money can be something that actually contributes to a joyful life, the full and free life that God created us to live. So that's the kind of instruction that Paul's giving us in this passage. So let's read through verses 17 to 19 together and see what he says. And again, this is Paul telling Timothy what he is supposed to command these rich Christians in Ephesus to do. So he says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." Now again, if you were here over the last couple of weeks, a lot of this sounds familiar. Right? In verse 17, Paul's talking specifically about some of the dangers that come with wealth, that our hope can migrate away from God to our stuff. And the solution to that he has is pretty simple. He commands them in verse 17. He says, remember, don't put your trust in riches. Instead, the only solid place where you can put your trust is in the God who richly provides for all of our needs. And then in verse 18, he goes on and he starts to give some very simple and practical steps that people can take to keep their hope from migrating away from God and to their stuff. So he says you can make a decision about what you do with your time and with your money. You can make a decision to be rich in good deeds. And you can make a decision to be generous to others. And Paul sort of commands him, if you do these two things, these are two practical decisions that you can make, action steps that you can take that actually keep your hope rooted in God and that prevent that hope from migrating away from God to the stuff that we have. So that's kind of what we saw in the first two verses. And this morning, I want us to dig into verse 19 a little bit and see the message that's there. But before we do that, we have to go back to verse 17. Because in verse 17, Paul sort of slips a little sneak preview in of something he's going to say in verse 19. So look together at how verse 17 starts. He says, command those who are rich in this present world. So command those who are rich where? In this present world. Now it's interesting, if you just are kind of reading through it, you might even blast by that word present without even noticing that it's there. But it's worth taking a minute and stop and thinking about that. Why does Paul even mention that? Why does Paul say in this present world? Instead of just saying, why don't you command people who are rich in this world to do this and that and the other? You see, Paul does that because he believes that there's more to life than just this life. He believes that there is a world to come beyond the world that we're currently in. So for Paul, the decisions that we make in every area of our lives, including the decisions that we make about the finances and the wealth that we have, those decisions need to be made not just with an eye on this world, but with an eye on the world to come as well. So keep that perspective in mind, and then look at what he says in verse 19, because it starts to make a little more sense. Again, this is Paul telling Timothy what to command these rich Christians to do. So in verse 19, he says this. Well, in verse 18, he said, hey, be rich by being generous and by giving away your time and some of your money. And then in verse 19, he talks about what the result of that is. He says, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Now, there's a lot going on in that verse, but Paul basically says that as people are generous and as they're rich in good deeds, there's a benefit for them in the world to come, right? He says that was a foundation for the coming age. But there's also a benefit for them in the type and in the quality of life that they experience in this world. He says in this way, you take hold of the life that is truly life. So Paul's encouraging them to be rich well now by showing them the benefits that come both now and later. Okay, now right now, this is where I can imagine that some of you are stopping and thinking, okay, that's what I thought. This is how the church is trying to manipulate us into giving more of our money away by making these pie-in-the-sky promises. Hey, if you make a big investment in the church now, you get like an even bigger mansion in heaven or something like that. And now, you may not think that when you read this, but that's what I used to think when I read this verse, especially when I wasn't interested in Jesus and the church. I would read verses like this and think, this is what is wrong with the church. They manipulate people. They play on people's desire for a good life in eternity, and they use that to just get their money out of them so they can, drive fancy cars and do whatever it is that other pastors must do. But here's the thing. In one sense, if you're thinking that, you are right. Because in this passage, Paul is making a very clear connection between what we do with our money now and what our life to come in the world to come looks like. But the thing is, Paul's not doing that because he's just trying to get more money out of people. And it turns out Paul's actually not doing that on his own. He didn't come up with this. When Paul gives that teaching, he's actually just repeating something that Jesus said over and over and over again when he was teaching about money. Let me give you an example of that. It comes from Luke's biography of Jesus, and I'll put it on the screen, but if you want to write it down, it's in Luke chapter 12, and I would encourage you to take some time and really dig into this in the week to come. But here's what the scene is. So Jesus is there, he's teaching, there's this big crowd following him. And in verse 13, there's this guy in the back of the crowd who kind of pipes up to get Jesus' attention. He's like, Jesus, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Now, again, at this day and age, this was pretty common practice, right? People would go to teachers who had a good reputation or rabbis who are well established, and they would try to get them to weigh in on issues, give them advice on things. It's kind of like how we would go, in a court of law today, we would want to bring in expert witnesses to do different things. That's part of what's going on. He's trying to get Jesus to weigh in on this. And apparently in this case, there's a brother who feels like he's getting the short end of the stick when it comes to the inheritance. So he's like, Jesus, I want you to go find my no good, lousy, rotten cheat of a brother and tell him to give me the money that's mine. And it's interesting to see how Jesus responds. So Jesus turns to him individually and he says, man, who appointed me the judge between you two? But then Jesus doesn't stop there. So Jesus takes this one guy's question and decides to use this as a teaching opportunity for the whole crowd that's there. So, he kind of tells this guy, hey, who appointed me the judge? And then he turns to everybody else, and look at what he says. He says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. See, at this point, I picture the guy who asked that question kind of sort of sneaking into the background, right? Because apparently somehow Jesus looked into the motives of this guy's heart. He said, this isn't about fairness. This isn't about justice with your inheritance. This is about greed, pure and simple. You just want more than you're getting. And Jesus knows that greed is a really dangerous thing. So he says, here's an opportunity to talk about that idea with everybody who's listening. And to make the point that he wants to make about greed, Jesus decides to tell a story. So here's that story. It starts in verse 16. And he says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. So the rich man thought to himself, what'll I do? I don't have any place to store my crops. So then he said, well, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I'll store my surplus grain, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Now, so far, what this guy is doing sounds like he's living out the advice that a lot of financial planners or like retirement investment counselors would give us. And in fact, I would argue, my guess is that at this point, the audience is really rooting for this guy. They're on his side. After all, they probably kind of envy him in the abundant harvest that he's had. And really, he's just being prudent. He's just trying to plan. And in many ways, he's living out a lot of the teaching that you see in the Hebrew Bible, in our Old Testament. There are verses after verse after verse about planning and saving for the future and trying to be a good steward of what you have. So in this point, the way Jesus is telling the story, the people in the crowd are identifying with that guy. They're like, he's doing it right. He's the poster boy for this kind of thing, which is why it's so surprising then the turn that the story takes. So this is what he says. So the rich man has just said, I'm going to store up for myself and eat, drink, and be merry. But then God says to the rich man, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who's going to get what you've prepared for yourself? And then the story's over, and Jesus sort of gives the moral of the story to everybody. And he says, this is how it's going to be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Now, my guess is that the original audience would not have seen that turn coming. Again, this guy's been kind of the poster child for prudent planning and sound financial management. But something's off here. I mean, Jesus is clearly not a fan of what he did. I mean, after all, Jesus has God call him a fool in the story. So what exactly is he doing wrong? What's the problem that Jesus is trying to highlight? Is he trying to say that we shouldn't plan for the future? That all of us who have like 401ks, we should just go ahead and liquidate that now and give it away and just trust that God's going to take care of us in our old age? And if he's not saying that, well, what is he trying to say? Well, there's a lot that's going on in this little story. But one of the things that I think we're supposed to take away from this is the idea that all of us would do good to stop and evaluate, why do we have the things that we have? I mean, what's the purpose of us even having wealth and money in the first place? Because if we're not careful, inevitably the drift of the human heart is that we begin to fall into the trap of thinking that everything we have is for us. Everything we have is for our benefit. But that's not how God sees things. That's clearly part of the point of this story. Right? We believe that God ultimately owns everything, that he provides everything. And he entrusts some of that to us. He sort of puts it on loan to us. And God entrusts the money to us for a number of reasons. Like he wants us to use it to take care of ourselves and our family. And then beyond that, he wants us to take it and invest it in taking care of others and invest it in doing the kind of work that sees his kingdom come and his will be done here on earth. See, that's the problem with the guy in this story. The problem isn't that he's saving for the future. The problem that he doesn't understand what his money is there for. The problem is that he is only taking care of himself. That's the only goal that he has in life for his money. And in fact, you can do this. If you read back through the story, it's just really interesting to see how often he uses the words I, or he uses the words me. You know, it's all through there, right? For him, the sole purpose of the money that he has is for himself, taking care of himself, looking out for him. So he's going to store it up so that his every need in this life is not only met, but exceeded, and then he can just kick back and relax and live the good life. And that's the flaw in his thinking. The guy is working with the assumption that everything that he has is for his consumption. Right? It's a little sing-songy, kind of rhymey line. Actually, I found that in Andy Stanley's book, How to Be Rich, that we have down there at the bottom of the sermon notes. It's a wonderful resource if you want to dig into some of these ideas deeper. But that's really what's going on, right? He looks at his wealth, and his assumption is that all of that is for his consumption. But that is just not true, at least not the way that God thinks about things. Because that guy was thinking only about himself right now, he missed out on some incredible opportunities. Specifically, he missed out on this wonderful opportunity to take what he has in this life and actually use it to be rich towards God. Now, there's something that's really interesting that sort of shows up in the story that I think we all need to keep in mind. You know, the riches that we have, as much as we're able to earn and save and store in this life, you know it's all temporary, right? Like, do you know how much money everybody leaves when they die? It is exactly the same for all of us and every single person who's ever lived in human history. We all leave all of it, right? None of us take a single penny with us when we go. Even King Tut, right? My first grader just went up to Amzi to see this big King Tut museum, right, exhibit. They put all that gold in the temple, but King Tut didn't take it with him when he goes. Instead, it gets shipped to Portland, of all places. So there you go. Personally, I think an awful lot of my money is going to Salem, and I'm not quite sure what they're doing with a lot of it, but that's a separate issue. But here's the thing, the money that we have, the wealth that we have, it's all temporary, and we are accountable for what we do with it. So instead of just spending it on ourselves, God invites us to use it to be rich towards God. And I think that's kind of an interesting phrase. And as best as I can make it out, we are rich towards God when we're generous to the people that God created and that God cares about. We're rich towards God when we meet our own and our family's own legitimate needs and we use the extra to care for others that are in need in this present world. We are rich towards God when we think this is not all for me. This is something God has blessed me with so that I can invest it to see his kingdom come and his will be done. That's what it means to be rich towards God. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make in this story. So then if you kind of move back to 1 Timothy chapter 6, in verse 19, when Paul starts making these strange comments about laying up treasures for the life to come, he's not making that up. He is standing squarely in the tradition of Jesus himself. Now, just to be clear, in case anybody has any questions, Paul is not saying that you use your riches to kind of buy your way into heaven. No, for Jesus and for Paul, it's the same thing, right? We are saved by grace through faith. But here's the thing. The money that we have and the choices that we make about what we can do with it, that actually provides opportunities for the Spirit of God to shape our heart and shape our character. The way we use our money, the way that we use our time, God takes those things and through his power, his purposes, he uses that to shape who we are. So as we make these decisions to try and be rich well, according to God's plan, his Spirit's at work in us, transforming us and shaping us into the very people that we were created to be. And even though I don't fully understand how that works, this is an idea that you see over and over and over again in the pages of the New Testament. God's Spirit working in us in this life is actually shaping us for the life to come, right? This life, the decisions we do, it shapes who we become. It shapes who we become as we move into our next life. And again, this idea about transformation of the heart, that is what is so revolutionary about Jesus teaching about money. Jesus doesn't want your money, right? He's got enough of his own. It's not like, man, if you guys don't give this, I'm just not going to be able to find it anywhere else. No, his goal is a transformation of our hearts. But he wants us to change the way that we interact with money because all too often it is money that gets in the way of the work that God is wanting to do. And it's money and the tension and the stress about money that gets in the way of the kind of life that God created us to live. Right? Whether you would consider yourself a follower of Jesus or not, there's just something that's true. Right? Christian teaching, most of the moral teachings from other religious traditions support this, even scientific research. Everything says that being rich does not necessarily mean that you will experience joy and fulfillment and peace in life. And yet a life that's marked by joy and fulfillment and peace, that is the lives that we want, right? And that is the kind of life that Jesus came so that every single one of us could enjoy. But just having money doesn't guarantee that you're going to get there, right? So for those of us who are followers of Jesus, who understand and trust his teaching, we know that really what the Christian principles that are laid out are true. Right? Our faith convictions actually lead us to this conclusion. When we begin to let the teachings of Jesus shape how we view wealth, when we begin to see our wealth not just in light of what it can do in this life, but through this lens of eternity, when we begin to realize that every single thing that we have is a gift from God that has been entrusted to us, when we begin to think about money that way, do you know what happens? We begin to lose our grip on our stuff. And more importantly, our stuff begins to lose its grip on us. And that's what frees our heart up to truly be transformed so that we can live the lives that we're created to live. And that's really the motivation behind this whole teaching series that we're doing. It is not about what we want from you, like we just want more of your money. It's about what we want for you. We want you to have a heart that is freed up to live the lives that God created you to live. And that's really what Paul's driving at, right? Again, look at how this passage ends, the end of verse 19. He says, in this way, they'll lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life, right? That's what we're driving at. When we can do this, we take hold of the life that is truly life. If we can figure out how to understand money rightly, if we can figure out how to actually be rich well, we not only take advantage of the unique opportunity that we have to be shaped for the life to come, but it can help us live the life that is truly life in the here and the now. So let's talk for a minute just in real practical terms as we're kind of closing out this series today. What are the things that we can do? What are the decisions that we can make to actually get there, to actually view and deal with money now in a way that shapes us for the life to come and helps us live full, free lives right now? Well, personally, I think to get there, you have to have a plan. I have yet in my life to meet anybody who became generous accidentally. It just doesn't seem to happen. But again, I love something. Another thing that I saw in that Andy Stanley book that we reference in the bulletin, he kind of looks at giving patterns for Americans and how they tend to engage in giving. And he says that most Americans, and research would back this up, most Americans are what he calls 3S givers. Okay? They're spontaneous, they're sporadic, and they're sparing. Right? They're spontaneous. Most Americans don't have a plan at the beginning of the year. Here's how much I'm going to give. Here's where I'm going to give. Instead, they just sort of give to spontaneous causes as they come up. Oh, there's a wildfire in California. Here's $100. Something else comes up. They send a little bit. So they're spontaneous in how they give. And because they're spontaneous, because they don't have a plan, they're sporadic. Right? They might give 1 month, and then nothing really touches them for 6 months, so they don't give again until then. And when you put those things together, if you're giving spontaneously and sporadically, often you're not giving very much. So you're giving very sparingly. And he would argue that those three things together, that kind of giving just doesn't really get a lot of traction on your heart, on sort of keeping the trust of your heart in God and not in the stuff that you have. So instead, if that's what the average American giver looks like, what does it look like to be an alternative to that? Because after all, right, if we're followers of Jesus, and if the way that Jesus talked about money, thought about money, and dealt with money is very different than how the world did that, it seems like followers of Jesus should also talk about money, think about money, and interact with their money and use their money in a way that's pretty different than the way the world does. So the alternative to being a 3S giver is what he would call a 3P giver. The 3 Ps being priority, percentage, and progressive. So priority, right? When we decide that we want to give, we give to God first. We make it a priority. We make a plan and we say, this is how much I'm going to give this year. And then what you do is you take whatever that amount is out of the paycheck first thing and you give it to God. And then you look at what's left and you make a budget to live on that, right? If being generous is a priority, that means you give first and you live on the rest. Because otherwise what's going to happen is we'll pay our bills and we'll live and we say, when we get to the end of the month, if there's anything left, we'll give something to God. But that's really not the kind of giving that God desires from people who have as much as we have, right? We don't want to just give God from the leftovers. We want to make it a priority. Then the second thing that he would talk about is being a percentage giver. So remember, Jesus' ultimate concern is not the total dollar amount that you give, but it is the state and condition of your heart. But when you look at his teachings, I think one of the things that you see is that the percentage that you give, not the total dollar amount, is really what gives you the most accurate picture of what's going on in the heart because it really shows you more about where your heart's trust is. So just an example of that. Let's say our teenage son decides that he wants to mow lawns this summer. He's not here today, so I can say this. It is very difficult to imagine that he would want to do that this summer. But let's say he did that. So he's going to mow lawns for a summer. And if at the end of the summer he decided to give away $1,000 from what he earned, that would be incredibly generous. My guess is that would be a huge percentage of whatever profits he made. It would really be a significant demonstration of how he's viewing that money and the effect it's having on him. But think about somebody like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett. If he came out and said, I have decided that for calendar year 2019, I am going to give away a grand total of $1,000. most of us would not think that that is an incredibly generous thing to give because he's got so much more that he can give. So again, it's not really the dollar amount. And I think that's why Jesus, when he talks about it, he's talking about the heart and the transformation of the heart and where the trust of your heart is. So he seems to be focused more on percentages than he is on some sort of random total dollar amount that he comes up with, because that's a better barometer for what's going on in your heart. Now, if you are not a percentage giver and you don't know where to start, what do you do? Well, let me give you two different options to think about. The first one is that you can give what Christians call a tithe, right, which is 10% of your income. That's a number that you see discussed in Scripture in a number of different places. So if you're looking for a place to start, that's a good place to start. In fact, I can tell you that has been my normal practice through my whole life. And I realize that my situation is different. It's actually really easy for me to do that because I just never knew anything different. From the time that I was a kid, I was like 5 years old, I remember parents saying, okay, here's your allowance, it's $1, and they'd pay it to me in dimes. And then as soon as they were done, they were like, why don't you take one of those dimes and we're gonna go ahead and take it to church this morning and you're gonna put it in the offering plate. It's like, okay. But so for me, I was like, I guess that's just what you do, right? I was actually in college when I realized, wait, you mean not everybody does this with their money? But by then, I was kind of hooked on it because I had experienced some real joy in giving. And I experienced just sort of this incredible transformation in my heart of seeing what it is that God was able to do through the little bit that I was giving. So as a result of that, that's just been my pattern all through life. In fact, even when I didn't consider myself a Christian, I still gave. And even when I kind of came back to Jesus, but I wasn't connected with a church when I was in grad school, I still gave. In fact, when I was at Ohio State, I got this very small stipend every month as a graduate teaching assistant. And I had a friend that I graduated from college with who was a middle school pastor at this church, and he had like zero budget. So every month, I would write a tiny little check from the tiny little check that I got and send it to him so that he could like buy a pizza or something for his middle school students. Because that was just a commitment that I had made. I just realized that's how I wanted to do things. It's something I've always done. But I also realize that if this is not something that you've always done, going from 0 to 10% or from wherever you are to 10%, like that can be a pretty big jump. So here's another option. If you think, man, I just don't know how to make 10% work, just pick a percentage. Pick a percentage and start there, right? Don't just say, well, I got to get to the point where I can start giving. No, start somewhere. In fact, if you don't know where to start, just try to be average. Right? The average American who makes $50,000 a year gives about 6% of their income away to churches, charities, and nonprofits. So maybe that's a place you could start. Start at 6%. Or if you financially don't think you can do that, just pick a number and start there. But that's what I want you to do. I want you to make it a priority. And I want you to make a plan and say, this is the percentage that I'm going to give away this year. And commit to doing that first, every pay period, and then living off of the rest. And then I just think over time, you will be amazed at the transformation that you begin to see in your heart as God's Spirit works through your generosity. So that's the first two of those, right? Priority and percentage. But there's a third one that has become more meaningful to me the older that I've gotten, which is this idea of being a progressive giver. And progressive giver really just means that over time, you try to raise the percentage of money that you're giving away. So maybe you give 6% away now, but you think, in 2 years, I'd like to give 7% away. Or you're giving away 12%, you think next year we're going to aim at 13. Now, some of you, just so you know, you have this like deer in the headlights look, like you're thinking, 10%, I don't even know how I could ever do that. Well, let's look at some real numbers and think about how that could work out. So let's say you graduate from college and you get like an entry-level job where you're making $30,000 a year. And as a priority percentage giver, you think, I am going to give $3,000 away this year, 10%, which is amazing. That's an incredible thing to do if you're making $30,000 a year. Just think about the impact that would have on your heart. Think about how loosely your stuff is going to grab hold of you if you can give that away each year. So that's a great place to start. But now, picture it's 30 years down the road. You're a lot more established in your career. Now you're making $90,000 a year. And the kids are out of the house. In fact, the house is pretty much paid for at this point. You've socked away some money in your 401k over the years, so you know you're going to be able to retire one day. So you're still giving 10% away. That's $9,000. But your expenses, your real expenses every year, are more like $50,000 at this point. So you've got $31,000 that you've still got left to play with, which is a great financial position to be in. But as we've seen in previous weeks, it's also kind of a dangerous financial position to be in. Because inevitably what happens in the human heart is we look at that 31K and we think, you know what, maybe I can use that to protect myself. That's some margin that I've got. That's some cushion that I've got to really keep myself safe. And maybe inevitably your trust begins to just migrate away from God and it migrates into your stuff or what this money can buy for you. So really, instead of seeing that 31K as sort of extra security, you can see it as an extra opportunity to take some percentage of that, however God leads you, to invest it in the work that he's doing here and around the world, to invest it in something that's ultimately going to transform your heart. And as I said, this is a practice that has become more meaningful to me personally over the years. This idea of being a progressive giver, trying to give away a little bit more each year. This is something we try to do in the King family. Doesn't always work. We don't always hit it because, expenses change and things. But if it wasn't a goal we were at least aiming at, my guess is we would never hit it. But the fact that it's out there, we can at least be moving towards it. And the reason that it's become more important to me is I just realized, I don't know what y'all's experience has been, but the older I get, kind of the more pull my stuff seems to have on me. Like I mentioned graduate school. So when I moved to Ohio State, to Columbus to start graduate school, literally everything I owned in the world fit in the back seat of a Ford Tempo. Okay, if you know, Tempos are not big cars, just so you know. Well, when we moved out here a couple of years ago, I think we could have fit 3 Ford Tempos in the truck that carried our stuff because we've got 4 kids and the stuff that comes with it, and we're more established in life. And I've just realized that the older I get, the more we tend to accumulate, the more I begin to think, well, what's going to happen to my stuff? Am I taking care of that well? And inevitably, the more you have, the more there's just this push from what you have to move your trust away from God into your stuff in the way that can take care of you. So I've just found that it has been really a powerful agent of God's Spirit, of spiritual transformation in my life and my heart to think, what does it look like, God, to be a little bit more generous this year? How are you calling? How are you leading? Just speak to us so that we can try to follow you in this. It really is something that has been helpful for us. And that's really the goal as we kind of wind up this series, is to help all of us think, okay, what does it look like wherever we are to move from being kind of 3S sort of givers to being more 3P kind of givers? And a lot of us really are that way. We're an incredibly generous church, and we're so grateful. So if you're already doing that, just keep it up, right? We're excited. We're glad that you're doing that, and it's exciting to see what God is doing in your heart as a result of that. But we want people to move in this direction, not because Suburban wants more of your money, but because we want to see the transformation of your heart so that we can all live the full and the free lives that we were created to live. And I think that's what a lot of us want, but a lot of us, there's some barriers that we face sometimes to getting there. For some of us, to be quite honest, the barrier is that we're just a little bit skeptical about churches and their motivations, right? Maybe we've gotten burned in the past or had bad experiences. So especially when a pastor who does get his salary from the church is up here saying, hey, you should be more generous. They're like, I knew it. Well, if you're skeptical about that, if you don't trust me, if you don't trust our church's motives, I just want to encourage you to do what we talked about doing last week. Give this a try. Make it a priority. Pick a percentage and give, but give it to another church. For 6 months, I'll give you a list. There's some wonderful churches in our area. Be happy for you to give to them. But keep coming here. Keep serving here. Keep learning about God here. Keep learning and experiencing Jesus Christ here. And just see what kind of transformation God does in your life and in your heart as you are rich well in the way that he lines that out. For others of us, we want to move in this direction, but kind of the barrier that we face is that maybe we've just got some financial baggage in the past, right? Decisions we made, commitments we made. It is really hard to think about giving away 10% of your income when you owe Visa $20,000, right? Or when you've got student loans that are getting ready to come due. Well, if that's the boat that you find yourselves in, I really would encourage you to sign up for Financial Peace University. Right? It's a class on sort of basic financial management, helps people get their financial house in order. That's going to start up next Sunday morning, but it could be an incredible opportunity to kind of remove that barrier so that money, instead of being a source of stress for you, could be something that actually enriches your life. And in fact, if we have your email on our mailing list, at noon today, I want you to check your inbox because you're going to get an email with a video that talks a little bit more about this class and a link on how you can sign up for it because we'd love for you to take advantage of that opportunity to try and remove that barrier. Yeah, and beyond that, the other barrier that sometimes I think some of us face is honestly, we forget or we travel. So we're not here every Sunday when the plate is passed. Or we have commitments. I was talking to somebody from the church this week who has an ailing mother over in Albany. And more Sundays than not, they're over there trying to take care of her as she nears the end of her life. So maybe the barrier for you is you're just not here physically, and you need some way that you can engage in giving on a regular priority basis. You can go online, and you can sign up for regular giving online. And keep your eyes open, because in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be launching some other tools that can help you do that can help you give regularly if that's the priority that you've made, even if you can't attend as regularly as you would like to. So here's what we're going to do. In just a minute, the musicians are going to come up, and we're going to sing a final song. But before we do that, I just want to pray. I want to pray that God would help each of us know what he's calling us to do with all the stuff that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. What it means for each of us in our individual lives, our individual checkbooks, our individual budgets, to be rich well in such a way that it truly honors him in the teaching he gave us. So let's pray about that. God, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to go to your word and to see truth that still can transform our lives on a day-to-day basis. Thank you, Lord, for the way that you provide for us. Many of us here, even if we don't feel like we're rich, just compared to a lot of folks around the world, you have blessed us tremendously. And we recognize, Lord, that with that blessing comes an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity to invest in your kingdom work, to see other people's lives transformed. And the wonderful sort of side benefit of that is that our own lives are transformed in the process. Our own heart is transformed as well. So God, for each of us, I just pray that as we think about the year to come, as we make plans about what it looks like to be rich well, about what it looks like to be a good steward of the things that you've loaned us, that you have entrusted to us, lead us through the power of your Spirit to know what you are calling us to do, to know what it looks like to be rich well in our particular lives, our particular situations. And then as you show us the way to go, we just pray that you would give us the courage to take the steps that we need to take to move in that direction. We ask all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.